He volunteered to fight the Nazis in 1944. 6 months later, he was shot and killed by an American bus driver for asking a question. His killer walked free in 28 minutes. On December 31, 1943, at the age of 34, Booker T. Spicely walked into a recruiting station in Philadelphia and volunteered for the United States Army. He wasn't drafted. He chose to serve. This decision would cost him his life 6 months later, but not on any battlefield overseas. He would die on American soil, killed by an American citizen, for the crime of wearing his country's uniform while black. The year 1944 marked a strange moment in American history. Over 2 million African Americans had registered for military service. They were fighting a war against Nazi tyranny and fascism in Europe, while living under Jim Crow tyranny and racism at home. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all the black soldiers themselves. The Pittsburgh Courier, the most widely read African American newspaper in the country, had launched what they called the WWII campaign. Victory abroad against fascism, victory at home against Jim Crow. 2 wars, 1 uniform. But in the segregated American military, that uniform meant different things depending on the color of the skin beneath it. Booker Spicely was assigned to the 3,713th Quartermaster Company at Camp Butner, North Carolina, a segregated truck company. He would drive supplies, not fight. The military didn't trust black men with rifles, but they trusted them with the logistics that kept white soldiers fed and armed. Spicely's job was to support the war effort from the shadows, invisible and grateful for the opportunity. Camp Butner sat about 20 miles north of Durham, in rural Granville County. Built in just 6 months starting in January 1942, it could house over 35,000 soldiers. Italian prisoners of war lived in relative comfort in one section of the camp. In another, black American soldiers lived in segregated barracks, separate from their white countrymen. German POWs captured from Rommel's Afrika Korps would later join the Italians. These enemy combatants could eat in restaurants that wouldn't serve the black American soldiers guarding them. They could sit anywhere on a bus. They could be treated at any hospital. The absurdity was breathtaking, but it was the law. When soldiers from Camp Butner got weekend passes, many headed into Durham. The city's Haiti district, known as the Black Wall Street of the South, offered everything a soldier on leave could want: music, food, company, and most importantly, community. For soldiers who spent their weeks following orders in a segregated army, Haiti represented a few hours of dignity. It was a place where being black didn't automatically mean being less than. Saturday, July 8, 1944, started like any other weekend for Private Spicely. He was in uniform when he arrived in Durham, spending time with friends in Haiti. As evening approached, he needed to return to Camp Butner. At the corner of Fayetteville and Pettigrew Streets, he boarded a westbound Duke Power Company bus. With him was Private Willie Edwards, another black soldier, and a woman named Carrie Jackson with her young child. The bus driver was a white man named Herman Lee Council. Council was 31 years old and had only been driving buses for 18 months. According to the War Department investigation that would later examine the incident, he had a reputation. He drank on the job. He had a hot temper. He was classified 4F, meaning he was medically unfit for military service, a fact that apparently gnawed at him when he saw soldiers, especially black ones, in uniform. Spicely and his companions took their seats in the second-to-last row of the bus. Not the front, not the middle, the second-to-last row. Already near the back, already in compliance with the segregation that ruled every aspect of Southern life. Then 3 white soldiers boarded the bus. Council's voice cut through the evening air. "You'll need to move to the very last seat." The other black passengers immediately complied. Carrie Jackson gathered her child and moved back. Private Edwards moved, but Booker Spicely stayed where he was. For just a moment, he stayed. He turned to the white soldiers boarding the bus. According to witness testimony that would later be given to both military and civilian investigators, he gestured at his uniform and asked a simple question. "Aren't I wearing the same uniform as you? Aren't I just as good to stop a bullet as you are? I thought I was fighting this war for democracy." The white soldiers, caught off guard by the question, actually agreed with him. In a surprising moment that revealed the arbitrary cruelty of Jim Crow, those white soldiers chose to sit in the back of the bus themselves. But Herman Council's face had already darkened with rage. This wasn't about seats anymore. It was about a black man questioning his authority. It was about a soldier in uniform making a bus driver classified as unfit for service feel small. Spicely eventually moved to the last row. He'd made his point, and he knew the danger of pushing further, but the damage was done. As the bus continued its route, tension filled the air. Council muttered something about having something that would cool Spicely off. The threat hung in the air like smoke. According to several witnesses, Spicely tried to defuse the situation. He even attempted to apologize to Council, sensing the danger he'd put himself in. But Council's rage had calcified into something darker. 5 minutes after the confrontation began, Private Spicely pulled the cord to signal his stop at West Club Boulevard. He exited through the rear door, as black passengers were required to do. Herman Council exited through the front door, as drivers were allowed to do. Council reached under his seat and pulled out a .38 caliber pistol. What happened next was witnessed by multiple passengers still on the bus. Council approached Spicely, who was unarmed and in full military uniform. The bus driver raised his pistol and fired twice at point-blank range, so close that the muzzle flash scorched Spicely's uniform. One bullet struck his chest, hitting his dog tags. The other tore through his liver. Both were fatal wounds. Private Booker T. Spicely collapsed onto the street. Herman Council climbed back onto his bus, put his pistol away, and drove off to complete his route. He left a 34-year-old soldier bleeding to death on a Durham street corner at 7:40 in the evening. The location where Spicely fell was less than half a mile from Watts Hospital. When military police arrived, that's where they took him first. It was the closest medical facility. It had emergency equipment and doctors. It could have saved his life. But when they carried Spicely through the doors, still breathing, still fighting for life, the staff at Watts Hospital refused to treat him. The hospital was for whites only. A man could wear his country's uniform, could be dying from wounds inflicted by a civilian, could be an active duty soldier, and none of it mattered. His skin was black, and Watts Hospital was white. The minutes wasted at Watts Hospital cost Booker T. Spicely his life. By the time military police transported him to Duke Hospital, which did treat black patients in a segregated ward, it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival. His death certificate would list the cause as pistol shot wound through heart and pistol shot through liver. Under the military's categorization system, his death was classified as DNB, died non-battle. He died on American soil, wearing an American uniform, killed by an American civilian. Herman Lee Council turned himself in later that same day. He'd finished his bus route first, naturally. He was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The investigation seemed straightforward. Multiple witnesses on the bus had seen everything. Spicely was unarmed. He'd been shot in the chest, not the back, but at point-blank range by a man who'd followed him off the bus. The physical evidence was damning. The witness testimony was consistent. This looked like an open and shut case. Then Duke Power Company, Council's employer and the owner of Durham's bus system, posted his $2,500 bail. They let him keep his job. He continued driving his route, carrying passengers, going about his business while awaiting trial for murder. The company simply moved him to a different bus line, away from the route that passed Camp Butner. Out of sight, out of mind. News of Spicely's death spread rapidly through the black press. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American all ran the story. Here was the WWII campaign made horrifyingly real. A black soldier volunteers to fight for American democracy overseas. He questions why he must sit in the back of a bus while wearing the same uniform as white soldiers. For this question, he is executed by a civilian. The killer is allowed to post bail and return to work. Spicely's older brother, Robert, who worked as director of commercial dietetics at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, immediately wrote to the NAACP's chief counsel, a lawyer named Thurgood Marshall. Marshall had already made a name for himself challenging Jim Crow in the courts. He was building the legal foundation that would eventually topple segregation in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision a decade later. Robert Spicely begged Marshall and the NAACP to get involved in his brother's case, but Durham's white power structure had already moved to block outside interference. Governor J. Melville Broughton feared that NAACP involvement would spark racial unrest. He reached out to two prominent black leaders in Durham, Dr. James E. Shepard, president of what would become North Carolina Central University, and C.C. Spaulding, president of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Both men were seen as accommodationists, willing to work within the system rather than challenge it directly. The governor asked them to convince Spicely's family to keep the NAACP lawyers out of the trial. In exchange, Broughton promised there would be a fair trial. It was a lie, but Shepard and Spaulding believed it, or wanted to believe it, or felt they had no choice but to appear to believe it. They pressured the local black attorneys handling the case, C.J. Gates and M.H. Thompson, to work with a white attorney and limit NAACP involvement. Robert Spicely objected. He knew what a fair trial meant for a black victim and a white defendant in 1944 North Carolina, but the pressure from Durham's black leadership was immense. These were men with power and influence in the community. Going against them meant risking their wrath and the fragile accommodations they'd built. Thurgood Marshall sent one of his attorneys, Edward R. Dudley, to observe the trial. Dudley was a graduate of Johnson C. Smith College in Charlotte and would later become the first African-American ambassador in U.S. history. He sat with the legal team but wasn't allowed to directly participate. When sidebar conferences happened between the judge and attorneys, Gates and Thompson were excluded. They could question black witnesses, but when legal arguments needed to be made, they were shut out. The trial was a performance of justice, not the substance of it. The trial began in mid-September 1944. Spicely's sisters Ruth and Evelyn and his brother Robert sat in the courtroom watching. The prosecution presented its case. Multiple witnesses testified that Spicely was unarmed. They confirmed he'd been shot at point-blank range after exiting the bus. They described how counsel had followed him off the bus with a weapon. The physical evidence matched their testimony. Herman Counsel's defense was simple: self-defense. He claimed Spicely had advanced on him threateningly. He claimed he feared for his life. This claim required the jury to believe that an unarmed man walking away from a bus represented a lethal threat to an armed bus driver. It required them to believe that following someone off a bus with a pistol was an act of self-preservation. It required them to accept that a black man in uniform deserved to die for questioning where he should sit. The all-white, all-male jury deliberated for 28 minutes. 28 minutes to decide if killing an unarmed soldier was justified. 28 minutes to weigh witness testimony, physical evidence, and the defendant's implausible claims. 28 minutes was apparently enough time to decide that a black life, even one in service to the country, was worth nothing measured against white supremacy and the sanctity of Jim Crow. Herman Lee Council walked out of that courtroom a free man. He returned to his job at Duke Power Company. He continued driving buses in Durham. He lived his life without consequence for another 38 years, dying peacefully in a nursing home in 1982 at the age of 69. But something unexpected happened in the aftermath of that acquittal. Instead of accepting the verdict and moving on, as Durham's accommodationist black leadership had hoped, the black community erupted. Louis Austin, publisher and editor of the Carolina Times, Durham's African-American newspaper, had been covering the case extensively. He was furious at the verdict, and even more furious at the black leaders who'd blocked NAACP involvement. In September 1944, Austin and his allies launched a campaign to take over the Durham branch of the NAACP. The Durham NAACP branch had been nearly defunct, with virtually no members and leadership that preferred negotiation over confrontation. Austin and his coalition won. They renamed the Durham branch after Booker T. Spicely. In November 1944, they launched a massive membership drive. In just 5 months, 197 new members joined. The Spicely case became the catalyst that transformed the North Carolina NAACP from a collection of disconnected local chapters into a coordinated statewide organization. Spicely's brother Robert used the case to organize a new NAACP branch in Tuskegee, Alabama, where he worked. The story spread through the black press, reaching communities across the country. Private Booker T. Spicely's death became a rallying cry, proof that the WWII campaign wasn't just a slogan, but a necessity. You couldn't wait for democracy abroad to create democracy at home. You had to fight for both simultaneously. The War Department conducted its own investigation, filing a report dated July 12, 1944, just 4 days after Spicely's death. The report's title was clinical. Subject: Racial Incident. Shooting of Negro Soldier Durham, NC, on 8 July 1944 at about 1940. The investigators noted the circumstances, the witnesses, and the clear injustice. Then they filed it away. The military did nothing. Spicely's death was categorized as DNB, died non-battle, and the army moved on. There were 2.5 million African Americans in uniform during World War II. They couldn't stop the war to seek justice for everyone who died at home, and they were dying at home. Booker T. Spicely was not unique. The Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University has documented approximately 8 to 9 similar cases of black soldiers shot by bus drivers in the 1940s. In Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, across the South, black men in uniform were being confronted, assaulted, and sometimes killed by white civilians who resented their very existence. The uniform that was supposed to represent service to country became a target. White supremacists saw black men in military uniform as a threat to the racial order. These soldiers had weapons training. They'd seen the world beyond Jim Crow. They'd experienced, however briefly, what it felt like to be treated as equals by British and French civilians overseas. They came back to America changed, and that change was dangerous to the system that required their submission. Private Booker T. Spicely's body was returned to his family in Blackstone, Virginia, for burial. The details of his funeral are lost to history. Where exactly he was buried remains uncertain, though researchers believe it may have been Greenview Cemetery, where other members of the Spicely family were laid to rest. He left behind siblings who would remember him, a story that would be suppressed, and a question that went unanswered. What does it mean to fight for a country that won't fight for you? For decades, Spicely's story faded from memory. Herman Council lived his life. Duke Power Company became Duke Energy. The bus stop where Spicely was shot was rebuilt, repaved, forgotten. Watts Hospital, which refused to treat him, was converted into the North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics. Students walked past the spot where Spicely bled out without knowing what had happened there. History buried him a second time. Then, in 2013, a law student named Shaneka Louise Davis was assigned to investigate Spicely's case as part of the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. Davis had lived in Durham as a child. She'd walked those same streets not knowing the history beneath her feet. When she uncovered Spicely's story, documenting it in a detailed essay, something remarkable happened. A retired death penalty defense attorney named James Williams read Davis's essay and was shaken by it. He'd spent decades working on North Carolina civil rights cases, but he'd never heard of Booker T. Spicely. Williams formed the Booker T. Spicely Committee. They had several goals. First, to get a state historical marker placed at the site where Spicely was killed. Second, to convince Duke Energy, the successor company to Duke Power, to acknowledge its role in the injustice. Third, to ensure that Spicely's story would never be forgotten again. In November 2023, the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources approved the historical marker. On December 1, 2023, what would have been Spicely's 114th birthday, the marker was unveiled at the intersection of West Club Boulevard and Broad Street in Durham. It's the first historical marker in North Carolina to specifically use the term Jim Crow in its text. Black U.S. Army soldier shot nearby in 1944 for resisting Jim Crow laws on a bus. Aftermath of killing helped revitalize North Carolina's NAACP. Spicely's family attended the unveiling. His nephew, Lincoln Thomas Spicely, who shares his uncle's middle name, stood with relatives who'd traveled from Virginia. His second cousin, Cynthia Walker Mitchell, spoke about the roller coaster of emotions the family experienced learning what happened, discovering that nothing was done to counsel, and then seeing her cousin finally honored. "What he was doing when he did that," she said. "Any one of us could have made a decision. You say enough is enough." Duke Energy contributed $100,000 to establish the private Booker T. Spicely Endowed Scholarship Fund at North Carolina Central University's School of Law. The scholarship benefits students working with the Veterans Law Clinic. The company's regional director for government and community relations, Indira Everett, acknowledged that no one at the company had known the story before the committee approached them. "Our Duke Energy team decided it was important to collaborate and to be a partner in acknowledging this story," she said, "and to make sure the private Spicely legacy continued to live on." Playwright Mike Wiley was commissioned to write a one-act play about Spicely's life and death. Changing Same, the cold-blooded murder of Booker T. Spicely, has been performed at venues across North Carolina. Wiley, who specializes in documenting African American history through theater, admitted he was shocked he'd never heard of Spicely, despite spending his career studying North Carolina's racial history. "I spend so much of my time knee-deep in North Carolina history," he said. "It shocked me that I didn't know the story of Private Spicely. Why didn't we know? Why was this story, and hundreds like it, buried for 70 years? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary. America has spent much of its history actively forgetting the violence it inflicted on black citizens. These weren't random acts by rogue individuals. They were enforcement mechanisms for a system of racial apartheid supported by law, protected by prosecutors, and blessed by juries." When Herman Council walked free after 28 minutes of deliberation, the message was clear. A black life, even in service to the nation, could be taken with impunity. Spicely's protest was small. He asked a question. He challenged an unfair rule. He wore his uniform and demanded it mean something. For that, he died. Compare his death to Rosa Parks, who 11 years later would refuse to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. Parks is rightly celebrated as a civil rights hero. Her act of resistance is taught in every school. But Booker T. Spicely did the same thing in 1944, and he paid with his life. His story was forgotten because the system that killed him controlled the narrative. But the truth doesn't die. It just waits to be uncovered. The Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project has documented over 1,000 cases of racial violence in the Jim Crow South between 1930 and 1954. Most of these cases never resulted in convictions. Most of the victims' names are unknown today. The violence wasn't exceptional, it was routine. It was the everyday enforcement of a racial hierarchy that required black Americans to accept their subordination or face consequences ranging from humiliation to death. Private Booker T. Spicely's story matters because it reveals the lie at the heart of American mythology during World War II. We tell ourselves a story about the greatest generation, about unity in the face of fascism, about Americans coming together to defeat tyranny. That story is true for some Americans. For black Americans, World War II was two wars, one against fascism abroad and one against white supremacy at home. They fought both wars in uniform, and thousands of them died in both. The hypocrisy was not lost on America's enemies. Nazi propagandists pointed to lynchings and racial violence in America to undermine U.S. claims of moral superiority. The Soviet Union would later use American racism as evidence of capitalist corruption. The U.S. government knew racial violence was a propaganda liability, yet it did almost nothing to stop it. Maintaining white supremacy in the South was more important than international credibility. President Harry Truman would integrate the U.S. military in 1948, 4 years after Spicely's death, issuing Executive Order 9981. Full integration wouldn't happen until the Korean War. Truman's order came not from moral enlightenment, but from practical necessity. The Cold War required America to present itself as the leader of the free world. That image was incompatible with a segregated military. But in 1944, when Booker T. Spicely needed his government to protect him, that protection didn't exist. Today, if you visit Durham, you can stand at the corner of West Club Boulevard and Broad Street and read Spicely's marker. You can walk 2 blocks to what used to be Watts Hospital and imagine a dying soldier being turned away. You can think about the 28 minutes it took a jury to decide his life had no value. And you can ask yourself, how many other stories are buried in our streets, waiting to be uncovered? Private Booker T. Spicely was 34 years old when he died. He'd lived through the Depression, moved north seeking opportunity, and volunteered to serve a country that considered him a second-class citizen. He asked one question: why should I move when I wear the same uniform? And that question cost him everything. His death helped galvanize a movement that would eventually tear down Jim Crow. He didn't live to see it, but his sacrifice mattered. On July 8, 1944, on a Durham street corner, American democracy died with Private Booker T. Spicely. It would take decades, countless acts of courage, and rivers of blood before that democracy was partially reborn. We're still fighting that battle. Every time we confront the gap between America's promise and its practice, we're continuing the work that Spicely started when he refused to move to the back of the bus. His question echoes across 80 years. If we wear the same uniform, if we bleed the same blood, if we fight the same enemies, why are we not equal? America still hasn't fully answered that question, but we owe it to Private Booker T. Spicely, and to the hundreds of others like him, to keep asking until we do.